In 1979, the world changed in ways that the United States intelligence community was catastrophically unprepared for. Iran, which had been one of America's closest allies in the Middle East for decades, suddenly wasn't. The Shah fell. The Ayatollah Khomeini returned from exile. The Islamic Revolution swept through Tehran like wildfire. And on November 4, 1979, militant students stormed the American embassy and took 52 Americans hostage. The crisis would last 444 days. It would dominate the news, define a presidency, and ultimately change the course of American foreign policy in the Middle East. But in the immediate aftermath, in those first chaotic weeks and months, the U.S. military faced a more practical and immediate problem. We had almost no Farsi linguists, none, zero, a handful at best. Why? Because Iran had been our friend. And as the saying went in the intelligence community, with all the sincerity of a policy that would come back to haunt us, we don't spy on our friends. That philosophy, noble in theory, disastrous in practice, meant that when Iran stopped being our friend, we were suddenly blind and deaf in one of the most volatile regions on Earth. We had Arabic linguists, we had Russian linguists, we had linguists for half a dozen languages that, in hindsight, we didn't need nearly as much as we needed Farsi. But Farsi, the language spoken by 70 million people in a country that suddenly hated us and was holding our citizens hostage, we had nobody. Well, almost nobody. The USS La Salle, AGF-3, was the flagship of the Middle East Force, a Blue Ridge-class amphibious command ship that served as the floating headquarters for USC, naval operations in the Persian Gulf, the Arabian Sea, and the wider Middle East region. She was old, commissioned in 1964, but she was capable, and more importantly, she was there. Right there in the Gulf, when everything went to hell. The La Salle had a crew of about 500 sailors, the ship's company, responsible for making the vessel actually function as a ship. But she also carried a staff of about 100, the command staff, responsible for planning and executing operations across the entire region. It was this staff that reported up through the Chief of Staff to the Admiral, who commanded all U.S. naval forces in the Middle East. I was part of that staff. CTR-3, Cryptologic Technician, Collection 3rd Class, E4, a petty officer but still fairly junior in the grand scheme of things. CTs were the Navy's signals intelligence specialists, the ones who intercepted enemy communications, analyzed electronic signals, and provided intelligence to support operations. We worked for the Naval Security Group, which in turn took tasking from the National Security Agency and, ultimately, the National Command Authority. In plain English, we were spies. Electronic spies. We listened to radios, intercepted communications, tracked radar emissions, and tried to figure out what the other side was doing before they did it to us. And in late 1979, with the American embassy in Tehran occupied and American citizens held hostage, we desperately needed to know what the Iranians were doing, which meant we desperately needed Farsi linguists. The problem was getting urgent enough that someone at a very high level made a deal with the United States Air Force. They had linguists. Not many, but a few. Could they loan us one? The Air Force, in a rare moment of inter-service cooperation, said yes. That's how Sergeant Mike came into our lives. I didn't know much about him before he arrived. I knew he was Air Force, which was already going to make him an oddity on a Navy vessel. I knew he was a Farsi linguist, which made him more valuable than gold. And I knew that I had been designated as his escort and handler, the guy responsible for making sure he got settled in, understood how things worked on a Navy ship, and didn't accidentally violate some obscure naval custom that would get him yelled at by a chief. What I didn't know, what nobody had bothered to tell me, was how absurdly unprepared both Mike and the military were for this situation. Mike had graduated from the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California, one of the most intensive language schools in the world. He had spent over a year learning Farsi, the grammar, the vocabulary, the cultural context, everything. He had become proficient, maybe even fluent, in a language that the U.S. military desperately needed. And then, upon graduation, he had been informed that Iran was our friend, and since we don't spy on our friends, he would be learning French instead. French. Because apparently someone in Air Force personnel thought that France, a NATO ally, a country we definitely weren't spying on in any serious way, was a better use of a trained Farsi linguist than, say, keeping his skills sharp just in case something happened in Iran. Mike had been pulled out of French class, literally mid-lesson chas from what he told me later, given about 12 hours to pack his belongings and put on a plane to Manama, Bahrain. His Air Force supervisors had helpfully advised him to leave his golf clubs and tennis racket at home, which I'm sure was devastating news for a guy about to spend 6 months on a warship in a combat zone. I couldn't resist needling him about that later. "Did you cry when they said you couldn't bring your tennis racket?" I wept openly, Mike deadpanned. It was very embarrassing. Ere the helicopter landed just before dinner, the distinctive whop-whop-whop of the rotor blades announced its arrival before we could see it, and I made my way up to the flight deck to meet our newest crew member. The SH-3 Sea King touched down with practiced precision, and after a moment, the crew chief slid the door open and a figure emerged, ducking instinctively under the still-spinning rotors, even though he was nowhere near them. It's what everyone does when they get off a helicopter. Some primal part of your brain screams that spinning blades overhead are dangerous, and you duck. Sergeant Mike stepped onto the deck of the USS La Salle, wearing his Air Force service greens, the light green uniform that made him look like he had just walked out of a recruiting poster. Against the backdrop of the grey steel ship and the blue-grey Persian Gulf beyond, surrounded by Navy personnel in their working uniforms, he stood out like a beacon. He was younger than I expected, maybe mid-20s at most, with the kind of clean-cut appearance that suggested he had very recently been in a much more relaxed environment. His hair was regulation, but not quite Navy regulation. His uniform was immaculate, in a way that suggested he hadn't yet learned what it was like to work 12-hour shifts in a space with inadequate ventilation. He looked, in short, exactly like what he was. An Air Force linguist who had been very suddenly and very dramatically yanked out of his comfortable world and dropped into a combat zone. I walked over, gave him a casual salute. We were on the flight deck, salute, and introduced myself. CTR-3. I'm your escort and guide to the wonderful world of Navy surface ships. Welcome aboard the La Salle. Sergeant Mike, he said, returning the salute. Thanks for the welcome. I have to admit, I've never been on a Navy ship before. Well, you're on one now, and that uniform, still I gestured at his Air Force greens, is going to make you stand out like a sore thumb. Any chance you packed something less Air Force? He looked down at himself as if only now realizing how different he looked from everyone around him. I have some other uniforms. What do you recommend? Working uniform. We call it the tropical uniform. Khaki chief pants cut off at the knee, hemmed nice and neat with a white t-shirt. It's what everyone wears for regular work. You'll blend in, and more importantly, you won't roast alive below decks. Sounds good to me. We grabbed his gear, a couple of duffel bags and a backpack, and I led him below through the maze of passageways and ladders that make up the interior of any naval vessel. Ships are confusing if you're not used to them. Everything looks the same: grey bulkheads, overhead pipes, narrow passages barely wide enough for 2 people to pass. But after a while, you develop a mental map and navigation becomes automatic. I got Mike situated in his berthing area, a small space he'd be sharing with a couple of other staff members, and gave him the 10-cent tour of the immediate area, where the head was, where he could get coffee, where the important spaces were located. You'll be working with the CTs in our spaces, I explained. That's where all the collection equipment is, the intercept positions, the analysis desks. It's classified space, so you'll need to get your access sorted out. But that shouldn't be a problem since you're already cleared. What's the operational tempo like? Mike asked. I laughed. Right now, insane. We're evacuating American and foreign nationals from Iran. We're trying to maintain situational awareness of what's happening in the Gulf, and we're basically operating blind because we don't have Farsi coverage. Which is why you're here. You're going to be busy. Very busy. How busy? 12 to 16-hour days, every day underway. When we're in port, the antennas come down. We have agreements about not spying on our friends from their territory, so you'll get a break then. But at sea, you'll be working pretty much constantly. Mike nodded slowly, processing this information. Well, he said finally, I guess that's what I'm here for. By this point, it was definitely dinner time, and Mike mentioned that he was hungry. I was hungry too. Shipboard life runs on rigid schedules, and missing a meal meant waiting hours for the next one, so we headed to the mess decks. On the way, I gave Mike a quick crash course in Navy customs regarding headgear and saluting. You wear your cover, your hat, when you're outside or in certain designated areas. You take it off when you go inside most spaces. When you pass an officer, you salute if you're outdoors or in a designated saluting area. Got it. Got it. Don't worry. We have similar customs in the Air Force. Yeah, but your customs are wrong, I said with a grin. Just remember, you're in the Navy now. We got in line at the mess decks, and that's when we encountered him. The chief petty officer who ran the galley was, in many ways, the perfect embodiment of a certain type of late 1970s Navy chief. He was short, maybe 5'6", and significantly overweight, his belly straining against his uniform in a way that suggested he sampled his own cooking, perhaps too enthusiastically. His uniform was rumpled and slightly stained. His face had the distinctive ruddy complexion and broken capillaries that suggested a serious relationship with alcohol, which was particularly notable given that U.S. Navy ships were officially dry, no alcohol allowed. He was, in short, a walking cliché, but he was also the gatekeeper of food, and on a ship, that gives you power. He spotted Mike almost immediately. Mike, despite having changed out of his Air Force greens into borrowed Navy tropical working uniform, still somehow looked Air Force. Maybe it was his haircut, maybe it was his bearing, maybe it was just that the chief had been doing this long enough to spot an outsider at 50 paces. The chief's eyes narrowed. He looked Mike up and down with the kind of aggressive scrutiny usually reserved for health inspections. Then he stepped forward, blocking our path. "You!" His voice was loud enough to carry across the mess decks. Several sailors turned to watch. "Get out of the line!" Mike looked confused. "I'm sorry, I said get out of the line." The chief's face was turning red. "I feed the Navy and the Marine Corps. That's it, I don't feed the Air Force." I stepped forward, trying to de-escalate. "Chief, he's assigned to the staff. I don't care what he's assigned to. He's Air Force gun. I don't feed the Air Force. We got enough mouths to feed without..." "Chief." I took off my ball cap, the one that said staff in gold thread on the front. On a ship, especially a flagship, wearing a staff ball cap meant something. It meant you worked directly for the command staff, which meant you ultimately worked for the admiral. It was a not-so-subtle reminder of the chain of command. I put the cap back on and looked the chief in the eye. "Take it up with my chief, Chief." The chief's face went through several interesting color changes, red to purple, to an almost burgundy shade that couldn't possibly be healthy. He wanted to argue. You could see it in his eyes. But he also knew that picking a fight with someone on the admiral's staff was a losing proposition. He stepped aside, muttering something that was probably not complimentary but was too quiet for me to make out clearly. Mike and I got our food and found a table. He was quiet for a moment, processing what had just happened. "Is it always like this?" Monty asked finally. "What? Chiefs being assholes to anyone who's not Navy?" "Yeah, sometimes." "Don't take it personally. He's probably just pissed that he has to work. I get the impression that inter-service cooperation isn't exactly the norm." I laughed. "Mikey, you're an Air Force linguist assigned to a Navy ship in the Persian Gulf during an international crisis. Not the norm, doesn't even begin to cover it." Over the next few days, I learned more about Sergeant Mike, and the more I learned, the more fascinating he became. He was from New England, Massachusetts specifically, and came from what he diplomatically described as a comfortable background. It didn't take much reading between the lines to understand that comfortable meant wealthy. He had attended a private preparatory school, the kind with Latin mottos and mandatory blazers, and alumni who all went to Harvard or Yale. His family had expected him to follow that path. Prestigious university, professional career, country club membership, the whole upper-class trajectory. Instead, he had enlisted in the United States Air Force as an E-1, the lowest possible rank, not as an officer, which might have made sense for someone with his educational background, as an enlisted airman, a decision that his family had apparently viewed somewhere between baffling and horrifying. My father, Mike told me one evening while we were waiting for our shift to start, asked me if I had suffered some kind of head injury. He couldn't understand why anyone would voluntarily enlist when I could have gone to college. "So why did you?" I asked. He shrugged. "I wanted to do something real. Something that mattered. College felt like just more of the same. More classrooms, more theory, more preparation for some hypothetical future. I wanted to actually do something. And learning Farsi seemed like there was something real. It did at the time. Languages fascinated me, still do, and the Defense Language Institute was supposed to be the best in the world." Plus, he grinned. "It was about as far from my father's world as I could possibly get. I had to respect that." Mike could have had the easy path, college, comfortable job. life funded by family money. Instead, he had chosen the hardest path available, enlisted in the military, and ended up on a warship in a combat zone. That took a certain kind of courage, or stubbornness, or both. It also explained something else about him, his sense of humor. Mike had a sharp wit, the kind that comes from intelligence combined with not taking yourself too seriously. He could make cutting observations about the absurdity of military life, while simultaneously being completely professional about his work. It was a balance that a lot of people couldn't manage, but he made it look effortless. The work itself was brutal. Mike's official assignment was to provide Farsi linguistic support to the collection operations. In practice, that meant he sat at a console wearing headphones for 12 to 16 hours a day. Every single day we were at sea, listening to Iranian military and government communications, transcribing important conversations, translating key intelligence, and trying to make sense of what was happening in a country that had suddenly become opaque to American intelligence. The volume of work was staggering. Iranian radio traffic had exploded after the revolution. Everyone was talking on the radio, military units coordinating with each other, government officials issuing orders, revolutionary guards organizing patrols. The airwaves were saturated with traffic, and Mike was the only person on the ship who could understand any of it. He also had a secondary mission, teaching the Navy's Arabic linguists to be at least somewhat functional in Farsi. Arabic and Farsi are related languages. They use the same script and share some vocabulary, but they're not mutually intelligible. It's kind of like how Spanish and Italian are related but different. An Arabic linguist could maybe catch a few words of Farsi, understand some context, but wouldn't be able to follow a conversation. Mike was supposed to change that. In whatever spare time he had, which was basically zero, he was conducting on-the-job training with the Navy CTs, teaching them basic Farsi, helping them learn to recognize common phrases and military terminology. It was an impossible workload, and he handled it with remarkable grace. I would see him in our spaces at all hours. Coming off watch at midnight, he'd still be there, headphones on, hunched over a notebook, transcribing a particularly important intercept. Going on watch at 600, he'd still be there, or maybe "stillpan" wasn't the right word, maybe already, was more accurate, working through a backlog of tape recordings that needed translation. "Guys, do you ever sleep?" I asked him once. He looked up from his work, blinked a few times as if coming back from somewhere far away, and smiled. "Sleep is overrated. Besides, if I sleep, I dream about Farsi conversations, so I might as well stay awake and actually be useful. That's either dedication or insanity. Why not both?" When we were in port, which happened every few weeks when we pulled into Manama, Bahrain for resupply and rest, the operational tempo dropped dramatically. The ship's antennas would be lowered, per the agreements about not conducting collection operations from friendly territory. Most of the CTs would get some actual downtime, a chance to go ashore, hit the suku, maybe have a beer at one of the hotels that catered to Western military personnel. But Mike kept working. Even in Port Isa, he would be in the spaces, listening to tape recordings from the previous underway period, refining his translations, conducting training sessions with the Navy linguists. "You know you're allowed to take a break, right?" I told him. "That's kind of the whole point of being in port." "I know," he said, "but there's always more work than time. And if I can get ahead on the backlog now, it'll make things easier when we're underway again." It was hard to argue with that logic, even if it meant he was working himself to exhaustion. Despite the crushing workload, Mike and I developed a genuine friendship. We'd give each other shit about the differences between Air Force and Navy basic training, two branches of the military that were famous for having relatively easy boot camps compared to the Marines or Army. We'd joke about stereotypes. Air Force personnel living in comfortable barracks with their golf clubs, Navy personnel living in cramped berthing spaces and painting everything grey. "At least we have standards," Mike would say. "Air Force facilities actually look nice. Yeah, but can you navigate in the dark using only the sound of machinery and the smell of paint?" I'd counter, "That's a real skill." When we had time off in port, and we'd explore Manama together. The souk, the traditional marketplace, was a maze of narrow alleys and small shops selling everything from gold jewelry to spices to electronics of questionable origin. We'd wander through, haggling with shopkeepers, drinking sweet tea, watching the incredible diversity of people who moved through the Gulf region. But our real bonding happened through the running club. One of the chiefs on the staff, a journalist chief who owned one of the first running stores back in the States, had organized an informal running club on the ship. When we were in port, we'd do organized 5K or 10K runs on the pier in Bahrain, sometimes with dozens of participants. It was a good way to maintain fitness, blow off steam, and feel like you were doing something other than work. When we were at sea, the running club would meet in the well deck of the La Salle. The well deck was a large open area at the stern of the ship, designed to launch and recover small boats. When we weren't using it for boat operations, it made a decent running track. 13 laps equaled 1 mile. But it wasn't exactly a smooth, easy run. 2 ship's boats, LCM-6 landing craft, were secured in the well deck with heavy cables. Every lap, you had to jump over these cables. In calm seas, this was merely annoying. In rough seas, when the ship was rolling, you had to time your jump with the roll of the ship. If you timed it right, you could run up the heavy wooden bulkhead that kept the boats in place, take a step or two almost horizontally, and then run back down as the ship rolled the other way. If you timed it wrong, you'd slam into the wet wood sideways, which hurt. Mike took to the running club immediately. He was fast. Prep school track team, he explained, and he had the competitive streak that makes runners push themselves harder than is probably wise. We'd run together in the well deck, challenging each other, pushing the pace, occasionally miscalculating the roll and slamming into the bulkhead, laughing at our own stupidity. It was during one of these runs that Mike made an observation that stuck with me. "You know what's funny?" he said, breathing hard as we jumped cables and navigated the rolling deck. 6 months ago, I was learning French, sitting in a comfortable classroom, conjugating verbs, reading literature, and now I'm jumping over boat cables in the Persian Gulf, listening to Iranian military communications for 12 hours a day. How does that happen? Shah, the military, I said, is very good at putting people in situations they never expected to be in. I'm not complaining. This is more interesting than French literature ever was, but it's just surreal sometimes. Welcome to naval intelligence, my friend. Surreal is pretty much our baseline. Mike's official loan to the Navy was supposed to last 6 weeks. That was the deal. The Air Force would lend us their Farsi linguist for 6 weeks. We'd get through the immediate crisis, and then they'd send us a proper replacement, or we'd figure out some other solution. 6 weeks came and went. No replacement appeared. The Air Force kept saying they were working on it, but weeks turned into months, and Mike was still with us. It wasn't hard to understand why. Mike was incredibly good at his job. He didn't just translate communications. He understood context, picked up on nuance, made connections between different intercepts. He could listen to a conversation and tell you not just what was being said, but what it meant, who the important players were, what they were planning. That kind of intelligence is invaluable. You don't give that up easily. So 6 weeks became 8 weeks, then 12 weeks, then 4 months, then 5 months. Mike kept working his 12 to 16-hour days. He kept training the Navy linguists, kept translating intercepts, kept providing intelligence that was probably saving lives and informing policy decisions at levels way above our pay grade. And through it all, he maintained his sense of humor and his professionalism. He never complained, never expressed resentment about being kept beyond his official assignment, never suggested that the Air Force or Navy had screwed him over. "I signed up to serve," he said when I asked him how he felt about the extended deployment. "This is serving. The location and duration are just details." It was a remarkably mature attitude for a guy in his mid-20s who was working himself to exhaustion. Around the 4-month mark, our CT detachment came up with an innovative idea to dramatically improve our collection capability. The problem with shipboard collection is that you're limited by line-of-sight propagation for VHF and UHF signals. Radio waves at those frequencies travel in straight lines and don't bend over the horizon, which means if a transmitter is over the horizon from your ship, you can't hear it. But what if you could get your receiver higher? What if, instead of having your antennas mounted on the ship's mast at maybe 100 feet above sea level, you could put them 1,000 feet in the air? The ship had an SH-3 Sea King helicopter. What if we put collection equipment in the helicopter? It was a brilliant idea, the kind of lateral thinking that makes intelligence work interesting. Put the receivers in the helicopter, fly it a few miles away from the ship, circle at altitude, and suddenly you can intercept signals from much farther away. The geometry works in your favor. Higher altitude means longer line of sight range. The staff approved the concept and told us to develop it. We'd need someone to fly in the helicopter to operate the collection equipment. Obviously, Mike should do it. He was the Farsi linguist, and Farsi intercepts were the priority. But then someone higher up the chain made a decision. Mike was too valuable to risk. If that helicopter went down, we'd lose our only Farsi linguist, and the entire intelligence picture would collapse. So they needed a volunteer, someone who understood collection operations, who could operate the equipment, who could recognize important intercepts even if they couldn't translate them. I raised my hand. "I'll do it," I said. The promises came fast. Flight pay and the helicopter missions would count toward my port starboard watch rotation, meaning I'd get more time off to compensate for the flying hours. They lied about both of those things, of course. No flight pay ever materialized. The flight time never counted toward my watch schedule. But that's the military for you. Make promises to get volunteers, then conveniently forget those promises later. But that's another story. The helicopter missions quickly became routine, which in hindsight was probably a dangerous mindset to develop. Each mission lasted about 3 hours, fly out from the ship to an operating area, orbit at altitude while I scanned VHF and UHF frequencies, record anything interesting, then fly back. Do this 2 or 3 times a week, and suddenly you're a veteran of helicopter-based signals intelligence collection. The SH-3 Sea King was a large helicopter, originally designed for anti-submarine warfare, but versatile enough to be adapted for all kinds of missions. The interior was surprisingly spacious, not comfortable exactly, but you could move around and there was room for equipment racks and a seat for me to work from. My gear was relatively simple. A couple of radio receivers that could scan across VHF and UHF frequency ranges, a tape recorder to capture anything interesting, headphones, and a notebook. The receivers were connected to antennas mounted externally on the helicopter. When we were at altitude, usually around 1,000 feet, those antennas could pick up signals from much farther away than anything on the ship could manage. The job was straightforward. Scan frequencies, listen for traffic, record anything that sounded military or official in nature. I couldn't understand Farsi, obviously, but you can learn to recognize certain characteristics of military communications, even if you don't speak the language. The tone, the brevity, the formality, the use of procedure words and call signs, these things transcend language. I would record everything that seemed relevant, and when we got back to the ship, Mike would listen to the tapes and translate anything important. It was, by most standards, a pretty safe mission. We stayed well away from Iranian territorial waters. We flew high enough that small arms fire wasn't a concern. The pilots were experienced, the helicopter was well maintained, and the Persian Gulf was relatively calm most days. But there was always a background level of tension, because the situation in the region was genuinely dangerous. The USS LaSalle had gone to general quarters, battle stations several times in the previous months, responding to potential threats that had turned out to be real. Iranian patrol boats would occasionally make aggressive maneuvers toward American vessels. There were reports of anti-aircraft batteries being moved to coastal positions. The Iranian military was on high alert, and they weren't particularly careful about distinguishing between aggressive and defensive American actions. In other words, the possibility of being shot at was always there, lurking in the background of every mission, which is why before my first helicopter flight, I decided I should learn at least a few words of Farsi. Just basic stuff. Common words that might be useful in an emergency. And specifically, I wanted to know the Farsi word for helicopter. It seemed like important vocabulary. If I heard Iranian military units talking about helicopters, our helicopter specifically, that would be very good information to have. It would mean they were tracking us, discussing us, possibly planning to do something about us. So I went looking for Mike. I found him in our spaces, in his usual position, hunched over a console, headphones on, notebook open, transcribing intercepts. It was late, maybe 0200 or 0300, and he looked exhausted. His eyes were red, his face was pale, and he had that 1,000-yard stare that comes from listening to foreign language communications for too many hours straight. I walked over and waved to get his attention. He looked up, blinked a few times as if coming back from somewhere far away, and pulled one side of his headphones away from his ear. "What's up?" he asked, his voice rough from not speaking for hours. "Quick question," I said. "I'm doing my first helicopter mission tomorrow, and I figured I should know at least one word in Farsi." "You know, just in case." "Okay." He looked skeptical about where this was going. "What's the Farsi word for helicopter?" Mike stared at me for a long moment, his exhausted brain clearly processing this request. Then he rolled his eyes, a gesture that somehow conveyed both exasperation and affection, and said, "I'm very busy, so I'm only going to tell you this once." I pulled out my notebook, the one I had already stamped with classification markings so I could use it as a logbook during flights. I flipped to a blank page, clicked my pen, and held it ready over the paper like a student about to take notes from a professor. "Ready," I said solemnly. Mike leaned back in his chair, stretched his neck, I heard it crack from 3 feet away, and said, "The Farsi word for helicopter is—" He paused for dramatic effect. "Are you ready?" "Yes, I'm ready. Come on, man." "Helicopter," I stared at him. "Say that again, ma helicopter." It's a loan word from English. Most modern military terminology in Farsi is borrowed from Western languages because the technology didn't exist in traditional Persian vocabulary. I wrote it down phonetically in my notebook, sounding it out as I wrote, "Helicopter." "Tais," I said slowly, "you're telling me that if I need to say helicopter in Farsi, I basically just put on a fake Farsi accent and say helicopter phonetically." "Exactly. So that's it. That's your big linguistic insight. That's it. Look, 80% of modern military and technical vocabulary in Farsi is just English words with a Persian accent. Radar is radar. Radio is radio. Tank is basically tank. We borrowed their words for algebra and algorithm. They borrowed our words for technology they adopted from us." I closed my notebook and shook my head. "I can't believe I asked you to interrupt your work for this." "Neither can I. Now, are we done?" "I have about 4 hours of intercepts to get through before my shift ends." "Yeah, we're done. Thanks for the language lesson, Professor. Any time. Try not to get shot down." "I'll do my best." The next day, I flew my first mission. The helicopter lifted off from the LaSalle's flight deck, the rotor noise overwhelming everything, the whole aircraft vibrating in that distinctive way helicopters do. We climbed to altitude and headed toward our operating area, the blue-gray expanse of the Persian Gulf stretching out below us. Once we were on station, I powered up my receivers and started scanning frequencies. The headphones isolated me from the helicopter noise, creating a strange bubble of silence, interrupted only by the hiss and crackle of radio static as I swept through the spectrum. VHF traffic first, mostly civilian, some marine bands, fishing boats talking to each other, commercial vessels coordinating movements. Nothing interesting. I moved up to UHF frequencies, where military communications were more common, and then I heard it, a clear transmission in Farsi, military in tone, crisp and professional. I couldn't understand the words, but I could hear the structure of military communications. Call signs, acknowledgements, formal procedure. I quickly adjusted my receiver to center on the frequency and hit the record button on my tape machine. The conversation continued for maybe 2 minutes. Different voices, back and forth, clear and urgent, and then I heard it. Helicopter. The word jumped out from the stream of Farsi like a beacon. Even with my extremely limited linguistic knowledge, roughly 1 word of Farsi, I recognized it instantly. Helicopter. They were talking about a helicopter. They were talking about our helicopter. My stomach did a little flip. I keyed the intercom to the pilots. Guys, I just intercepted Iranian military communications, and they're talking about a helicopter. I think they're talking about us." The pilot's voice came back, calm and professional. "Roger, did they sound hostile?" "I don't know. I don't speak Farsi. But they definitely mentioned a helicopter, and we're the only helicopter in this area." "Copy. Recommend we return to base." "Yeah, I think that would be wise. And maybe do it low and fast." "Roger that." What happened next was one of the more thrilling experiences of my life. The pilot banked the SH-3 hard to the left, and I felt my stomach lurch as the helicopter went from level flight to what felt like a 90-degree bank. Then the nose dropped, and we started descending fast. Within seconds, we were at wave-top level, maybe 20 feet above the surface of the Persian Gulf. The water was placid that day, smooth and glassy, and it was passing beneath us in a blur. The engines were screaming, the rotors hammering, the whole aircraft shaking with the effort of maintaining maximum speed at minimum altitude. It was, objectively, terrifying. It was also, I have to admit, pretty damn cool. The pilot was flying with the kind of precision that comes from hundreds of hours of experience. We stayed low, so low that when we approached the LaSalle to land, we actually had to climb to reach the flight deck. The ship's deck was higher than our cruise altitude had been for the return flight. We landed with a solid thump, the landing gear absorbing the impact, and the pilot immediately started shutting down systems. I grabbed my tape recordings and my notes and climbed out of the helicopter, my legs a bit shaky from the adrenaline dump. The crew chief looked at me. "You good?" "Yeah." "That was interesting." "That's one word for it. What did you hear?" "Iranian military talking about helicopters. I think they were tracking us." "Mike will know for sure once he listens to the tape." I found Mike a few hours later. He had listened to my recording and his expression was serious. "They were tracking you," he confirmed. "Not just your helicopter specifically, but all American helicopter operations in that area. They're coordinating observations between different coastal observation posts, reporting altitudes and headings, trying to establish patterns. So they're building an intelligence picture of our operations." "Exactly. Which means they're not just passively observing, they're preparing. Whether that means preparing to avoid us or preparing to engage us, I can't tell from this one intercept. But it's not good. Should I tell someone? I already did. It's in my daily intelligence summary that goes up to the staff. They'll decide what to do with it. Thanks for the quick turnaround on the translation. That's what I'm here for." He paused, then grinned. "And thanks for recognizing the one Farsi word I taught you. I'm a hell of a language instructor. The best. You should open a school. Learn Farsi in one easy word. Helicopter edition. I'll work on the curriculum." The helicopter missions continued for weeks, then months. Each time I would scan frequencies, record traffic, bring the tapes back for Mike to translate. We developed a rhythm, a system that worked. The missions weren't always dramatic. Most of the time I would hear routine traffic, civilian communications, nothing particularly interesting, but occasionally we'd catch something important, something that revealed Iranian military dispositions or intentions or capabilities. The program became valuable enough that it attracted attention from higher levels of the intelligence community. What had started as an improvised solution to a collection problem, stick a receiver in a helicopter and see what happens, had evolved into a legitimate intelligence capability. None of us knew it at the time, but that little improvised program would eventually receive formal recognition. But that came later, long after Mike was gone, long after I had transferred to other assignments, long after the immediate crisis of the Iranian hostage situation had faded into history. For now, in those months of late 1979 and early 1980, we were just doing our jobs. Mike was translating intercepts and training linguists. I was flying helicopter missions and recording traffic. The ship was maintaining its presence in the Persian Gulf, a visible symbol of American power in a region that had suddenly become much more complicated and dangerous. And every time I heard helicopters in an intercept, I would smile, key the intercom, and tell the pilots it was time to go home. Mike had taught me well. Mike stayed with us for 6 months. 6 months of 12 to 16-hour days at sea, listening to Iranian military communications, translating intercepts, training Navy linguists who were trying desperately to pick up enough Farsi to be useful. 6 months of living in cramped berthing spaces, eating Navy food, running in the well deck, dealing with chiefs who resented his Air Force background. 6 months of being the most valuable person on a ship of 600 souls, because he was the only one who could tell us what the Iranians were actually saying. The official paperwork kept saying he'd be returned to Air Force control soon, next week, next month. When a replacement arrived, when the situation stabilized, the promises were endless and meaningless. The Air Force wanted him back, but the Navy needed him more. And in bureaucratic battles, need tends to win over want. Mike never complained about it. Not once, at least not to me. He just kept working, kept translating, kept teaching. If he resented being kept beyond his official assignment, if he was frustrated with the Air Force for not fighting harder to get him back, if he was exhausted from the relentless pace, he never showed it. "This is what I signed up for," he said once when I asked him how he was holding up. Not this specifically, obviously, but serving, being useful, making a difference. The location and duration are just details. It was a remarkably mature perspective for a guy in his mid-20s who was being worked to exhaustion. The helicopter program continued to evolve and expand. What had started as an experimental idea, put a receiver in a helicopter and see what happens, had become a formal operational capability. We developed procedures, refined our techniques, coordinated with the pilots to optimize collection opportunities. The intelligence we were gathering was being incorporated into daily briefings, operational planning, and strategic assessments that went all the way up the chain of command. I flew dozens of missions over those months. Some were routine, yielding nothing but civilian traffic and commercial communications. Others produced valuable intelligence, Iranian military units coordinating movements, discussions of weapons systems, conversations about American vessel locations and activities, and every time I heard helicopter in a transmission, I would note the time and frequency, mark the tape, and know that Mike would find something interesting when he listened to it later. The intercepts painted a picture of an Iranian military that was simultaneously overconfident and paranoid. They knew where we were. It's hard to hide a warship in the Persian Gulf, and they tracked our movements obsessively, but they also seemed uncertain about what to do with that information. Were we a threat? Were we just observing? Would we intervene militarily to rescue the hostages? The uncertainty went both ways. We were tracking them while they were tracking us, each side trying to predict what the other might do, each side preparing for possibilities that ranged from peaceful resolution to military confrontation. It was, in retrospect, one of the more dangerous periods of my naval career, even though most of the danger was potential rather than realized. We were operating in a very tense environment, with very limited intelligence capabilities, during an international crisis that could have escalated at any moment. The fact that it didn't escalate into something worse was due, in part, to the intelligence that people like Mike were providing. When you know what the other side is thinking, saying, and planning, you can avoid misunderstandings. You can distinguish between aggressive posturing and genuine threats. You can give your leadership the information they need to make smart decisions. That's what intelligence work is really about. Not the James Bond stuff, not the dramatic confrontations, but the patient, grinding work of listening and analyzing and providing context. Mike was doing that work, hour after hour, day after day, for 6 straight months. Eventually, inevitably, the Air Force recalled him. Not because the situation had stabilized. The hostages were still being held. The crisis was ongoing. The need for Farsi linguists was as urgent as ever. But because even military bureaucracies have limits to how long they can bend the rules, 6 months was apparently that limit. The official word came down through channels. Sergeant Mike was to be detached from the USS La Salle and returned to Air Force control. Transportation would be arranged. He had 72 hours to pack his gear and prepare for departure. When Mike told me, he looked genuinely conflicted. "I feel like I'm abandoning you guys," he said. "Oh, there's still so much work to do." "We'll figure it out," I told him, with more confidence than I felt. "The Navy linguists you trained are getting better. Maybe the Air Force will send us your replacement, or maybe the crisis will resolve itself, and we won't need Farsi coverage anymore." "You don't believe that last part any more than I do." "I do," I admitted. "But what else can we say? You can't stay here forever." "I know, it just feels unfinished." I understood what he meant. Intelligence work rarely feels finished. There's always one more intercept to translate, one more pattern to analyze, one more question to answer. You never get to the end of the work. You just stop at some arbitrary point and hand it off to whoever comes next. Mike's last few days on the ship were strange. People kept stopping by to say goodbye, to thank him for his work, to wish him well. Even the chief who had tried to kick him out of the galley on his first day grudgingly acknowledged that Mike had done good work. The CTs he had trained threw him an informal going-away gathering in our spaces. Nothing fancy, just some snacks from the ship's store and genuine expressions of gratitude. These were guys who had spent months learning from him, who had gone from barely recognizing Farsi words to being able to handle basic intercepts on their own. They knew what they owed him. One of them, a young CT3 who had been particularly dedicated to learning Farsi, gave a short speech. "Before Mike got here, we were basically deaf to half the traffic in the Gulf. Now we can at least understand some of it. That's because Mike spent hundreds of hours teaching us, even when he was exhausted from his own work. We're better linguists because of him. We're better intelligence professionals because of him. And personally, I'm grateful I got to learn from someone who actually gives a damn about doing the job right." Mike looked genuinely touched, which was saying something for a guy who usually maintained an ironic distance from sentimentality. "Thanks," he said. "Honestly, you guys made it easy. You wanted to learn, you worked hard, and you asked good questions. That's all a teacher can ask for. I hope the Air Force sends you someone even better, but if they don't, you've got enough knowledge now to figure things out on your own." Dazed that the day Mike left, I walked him up to the flight deck where the helicopter was waiting to take him to Bahrain. where he'd catch a flight back to the States, back to the Air Force, back to a world that included things like golf courses and comfortable barracks and normal working hours. We stood there for a moment, the helicopter's rotors already spinning up, the noise making conversation difficult. "Take care of yourself," I said, having to raise my voice to be heard. "You too. Try not to get shot down." "I'll do my best. And hey, thanks for teaching me Farsi." He laughed. "One word. I taught you literally one word. That most important word in the language. For you, maybe. For everyone else, probably not." We shook hands, and then Mike grabbed his bags and walked toward the helicopter. He climbed in, gave a final wave, and the crew chief slid the door shut. The helicopter lifted off, banked away from the ship, and headed toward Bahrain. I watched until it disappeared from sight, then headed below decks to start my shift. The work continued, with or without Mike. That's how the military works. People come and go, assignments begin and end, but the mission continues regardless. Years passed. I eventually left the Navy, transitioned to civilian life, built a career that had nothing to do with signals intelligence or helicopters or the Persian Gulf. The Iranian hostage crisis resolved itself, badly, messily after 444 days of captivity, and faded into history, just another chapter in the complicated relationship between America and the Middle East. I lost touch with Mike. We had exchanged addresses before he left, promised to stay in contact, but life has a way of making those promises hard to keep. Letters became less frequent, then stopped altogether. I heard through the grapevine that he had been assigned to NSA for his next tour, which I wouldn't wish on anyone. NSA was notorious for grinding up talented people with impossible workloads and bureaucratic dysfunction, but I never confirmed it. Then, several years after I had left the Navy, I received a letter from the Chief of Staff who had been on the USS La Salle during my time there. He had tracked down my address, which was impressive in itself. The letter was brief and formal, the kind of official correspondence that officers send to former subordinates when they want to convey important information. "Dear Petty Officer, name. I am writing to inform you that the helicopter-based collection program that you helped develop aboard USS La Salle has been awarded the Travis Cup by the National Security Agency. This award recognizes exceptional achievement in signals intelligence operations and is one of the highest honors in the cryptologic community. Your contributions to this program were instrumental in its success. The intelligence gathered through these operations provided critical insight during a significant period of international tension. Congratulations on this recognition. Very respectfully, Chief of Staff's name and rank." I read the letter several times, feeling a strange mixture of pride and melancholy. The Travis Cup was a big deal. NSA doesn't give out awards lightly, especially not for field operations. The fact that our improvised helicopter program had been officially recognized at that level was genuinely surprising and gratifying. But I also thought about Mike. He had been essential to that program's success. Without his translations, the intercepts I collected would have been meaningless noise. Without his training of the Navy linguists, the program couldn't have continued after he left. He deserved recognition at least as much as I did, probably more. I wrote back to the Chief of Staff, thanking him for the notification and asking a favor. Could he inform the Air Force about the award? Could he make sure that Mike's service record reflected his contribution to the program? I never received a response to that letter. I don't know if the Chief of Staff forwarded the information to the Air Force, or if Mike's records were ever updated, or if he even knew that the program he had supported had received such prestigious recognition. I'd like to think he found out somehow. I'd like to think that somewhere in an Air Force personnel file, there's a note about his service aboard the USS La Salle and his contribution to a Travis Cup-winning intelligence program. But I honestly don't know. Looking back now, decades later, I realize that Mike represented something important about military service that doesn't get talked about enough. He came from a background of privilege and comfort, could have had an easy life, and instead chose one of the hardest paths available. He enlisted in the military, learned a difficult language, volunteered for a deployment to a combat zone, and then worked himself to exhaustion doing a job that most people have never heard of and would never understand. He did all of this with grace, humor, and professionalism. He never complained, never took shortcuts, never treated the work as anything less than critically important. He trained his replacements even though he was being worked to death himself. He maintained his sense of humor, even in the most stressful circumstances. And when his time was up, When the Air Force finally recalled him after 6 months instead of the promised 6 weeks, he went without fanfare or complaint. Back to the Air Force, back to golf courses and comfortable barracks, back to a world that probably seemed absurdly peaceful after 6 months on a warship in a crisis zone. I hope he did well. I hope the Air Force appreciated what they had in him. I hope his next assignment was better than NSA, if that's where he went. I hope that somewhere along the way, someone thanked him properly for what he did. But even if none of those things happened, even if his service was never properly recognized, even if his records show nothing more than a routine assignment to a Navy vessel, I know the truth. Mike was essential. The intelligence he provided was valuable. The people he trained went on to support operations for years after he left. The program he helped develop won one of the highest awards in the intelligence community. And whenever I think about those months on the USS LaSalle, whenever I remember the tension and the work and the strange camaraderie of that deployment, I think about Mike sitting at his console at 3 in the morning, headphones on, patiently translating one more intercept, training one more linguist, doing one more impossible task in an endless series of impossible tasks. You're in the Navy now, we told him on his first day. For 6 months he was damn good at it,